picking up the cards for the audience. Somebody stopped by and actually dropped off a question for you. And a lot of preface and a lot of documents, I'll give it to you. Should the state auditor, and how should the state auditor evaluate statewide responsibilities for reporting to the background check database on guns and make recommendations for improvements and consistent monitoring?
Okay, just a real quick preface in my response to that question. First of all, I am a gun owner, and I have been for many years. And I come from a culture where gun owning is, gun ownership, responsible gun ownership is common and valued. But I also understand the importance and need to place reasonable restrictions on access to dangerous firearms. And to the extent that it matters to those in the audience, I believe there is a balance to be arrived at here. In answer to the question, the first thing that comes to my mind is what entity would be subject to the audit? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. The second issue has to do with how our state revenue is associated with this and whether that would give the auditor jurisdiction to do a comprehensive audit on background checks. Open to the idea, I don't mean to be evasive or indirect, but as I see it, I'm not sure there's a role for the state auditor in that regard. It's not to say it's not important, it is. And I'm happy to consider different perspectives, but I just don't see the direct correlation to the duties of the office.
What are your feelings about the redistricting issue that is going to be on the May ballot? What are its strengths, what are its holes?
Okay, so based on my remarks, you might guess that I'd like to see the complete and utter depoliticization of the process of redistricting, and you'd be correct in that guess. So my sense is it doesn't go far enough in taking the politics out, but it is a step in the right direction, and it represents a compromise. A compromise that I think in large part was induced by the hard work of hundreds, if not thousands, of petition gatherers and the leverage that brought, but a compromise nonetheless. And we got to practice what we preach. And I think compromise, I preach the need for compromise, so it's hard for me to stand up here and say it's not a good plan. I'm going to vote for it, and I support it and encourage everyone here to consider voting for it as well. I think it represents a step in the right direction.
At least partially related, should the position of state auditor be a partisan position? And does partisan politics factor into the office?
Well, it's a constitutional office, and it would require a constitutional amendment to change that. And the alternative to an elected partisan position would likely be a gubernatorial appointment, as they do in some states. So I think it's not a perfect world, but it's very much like judges. There are questions about whether judges should be elected as well. Bottom line is, I think it's the auditor's unique in terms of the responsibility that position has to the people of Ohio. It answers to the people of the state of Ohio. I have committed time and again to maintaining an objective, nonpartisan position, particularly when it comes to issues associated with gerrymandering. You heard what I said earlier. I think that same logic extends to the auditing powers associated with state agencies and anybody that receives state money. It should not be exercised in a partisan fashion, but I just don't see any alternative to the partisan elections that we have absent a constitutional change.
What can you do as auditor to help empower low-income families with financial stability, for example, about payday loans?
So you heard me reference payday lending in my talk. I think payday lending is a pretty clear when I say payday lending. The process associated with how this General Assembly has regulated that industry is a clear example of what's wrong with politics in Columbus. The industry itself has paid millions of dollars to members of the General Assembly, and it shows. The results are clear. Ohio's payday lending statutes are some of the loosest in the country. You can pay up to almost 500% annual interest. You get caught up, especially those of limited financial means, get caught up in these things. It becomes an endless cycle. And it is not just an example of the way that politics influences policy, or money influences policy, but it's an example of the fact that nothing is off limits. Nothing is sacred. Not the poor, not your children. Nothing is off limits when it comes to the influence of money in politics. So the first part of that question entailed a lot of different components. What do you do about people who are financially challenged as auditor? The second part deals with a much more specific issue. What I hope to do, and this is different, I want to shine a light on that process associated with pay for play. I want to figure out a way to use these powers dynamically and creatively to make sure that these legislators know somebody's watching. Right now, nobody's watching. And I want to change that. And I think generally speaking, with respect to the first part of your question, when we pass laws that are objective and well-intentioned, all of this benefit, especially the poor.
If follow up with specifics on the payday lenders. If the legislature doesn't change the law, is there something under the current structure that the auditor can and should do?
Again, the answer is no. The auditor doesn't have lawmaking authority, but what the auditor can do is use the powers of his or her office as a soapbox. And I intend to do that, to rail against the process which is inherently unfair to most Ohioans.
Will you audit Jobs Ohio and discuss the merits behind auditing private companies that are contracted by the state?
By statute, the auditor is not allowed to audit Jobs Ohio, which I think is preposterous. Again, about $1 billion a year. These are taxpayer monies, revenues off of liquor sales that go into Jobs Ohio. And they may be doing a great job with that money. But we don't know. The legislature passed a law that says the auditor can't open the books and do a comprehensive audit. I can't change that law, but I intend to try to raise public awareness about the need to change it and use the office in that capacity. And the second part of the question, if I understand it correctly, look, these are taxpayer dollars that are going to public entities. There are many cases and examples where that makes good sense. But I'm all about trying to increase transparency, and it is vital. Not that just that the auditor is taking a look at these monies to make sure that they're being spent in accordance with law, in accordance with sound accounting principles, but the people of Ohio have an advocate who's looking out for them as well. So, yeah, I think there's merit in it, and I will continue to do it robustly and aggressively.
Please tell us how you can use the power of the office to curb greenhouse gas emissions and enforce environmental protections.
Okay. So this is interesting. I want you to kind of follow me on this one. So I'm a coal country Democrat that voted for cap and trade, which is probably not the only reason, one of the reasons I'm no longer in Congress. So I believe in climate change and the perils associated with global warming and the need for us to do something about it, because in large part, if not primarily, it's anthropogenic. Let me do it in reverse order here. Think about this for a moment. The state of Ohio, several years ago, had a burgeoning, robust wind energy business. We had wind energy companies from around the world looking at Ohio, making plans in Ohio, putting money into developments in Ohio. And one state senator managed to put an amendment into a bill 3 years ago under cover of darkness without a hearing, that more than doubled the wind setback requirements, meaning couldn't build these things any closer than a certain amount of feet from somebody else's property line. And that effectively killed the wind industry in Ohio. In its tracks, we have lost over $4 billion in provable investments as a result of that one amendment. $4 billion. This is in direct investments. This doesn't include indirect or ancillary investments associated with companies like Google or Apple or Microsoft that won't come to a state if they don't have enough advanced energy capacity. Likewise, the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, chose to freeze renewable portfolio standards a few years ago, and now is on the verge of repealing them altogether. These were designed to push out the technology associated with advanced energy, solar, wind, designed to push out investments in Ohio. The legislature froze those standards, and again, doesn't appear to be inclined to thaw them out. This too has caused the state of Ohio enormous amounts in terms of investments and jobs. I think there's a role for the auditor here. So I don't know if believe me, this is something I've been looking at now for months, trying to figure out a way to use the powers of this office to shine a light on what we're losing by being so regressive in our policies. One way may be to get it from the ground up. Work with some of the local school districts that have lost millions of dollars in revenues as a result of these regressive measures. I'm not here to tell you all the details yet. I'm still working them out, but I am here to tell you this is a priority for me, and I intend to exercise the powers of this office in a creative way to try, if nothing else, to shine a light on the injustice associated with these regressive policies.
We got a lot of people who believe in the power of this auditor's office, because now you're asked to tell us what the auditor can do to fight repeated killings of black men by police.
You're testing my ability to stretch the confines of this office to cover all these. And I don't mean to belittle it. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is an important movement, and any form of intolerance and oppression is wrong. I don't have an answer for that other than to say this. I'm committed to moving the needle on the issue associated with the influence of money and the creation of policy. And when that happens, when we get to a society that is basing its decisions purely and solely on what's best for everybody, I think we all experience a measure of justice. So to the extent that our legislature acts more rationally, our constitutional offices act more rationally as opposed to subjectively with consideration of monetary campaign contributions, issues like that they're going to be resolved. It'll be movement in the right direction on issues like that.
This is back to the issue of guns. You co-sponsored the National Reciprocity Act with Representative Steve King of Iowa. Do you still support reciprocity?
And so let me just have a kind of a candid conversation about the gun issue again. The gun issue is a dilemma for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is the important and integral piece of culture in certain parts of our state, certain parts of our country. In my family, everybody owns a gun. I mean, there are shotguns, there are handguns, and everybody's responsible in how they own that gun. It's important for the families of Appalachia, the hunters, the target shooters, the collectors. And on the other side of this equation are these devastatingly tragic events that keep happening over and over and over again. And we live in a culture that seems to, it wants everything to be black and white. But nothing's ever black and white. Everything's always gray. I think things like reciprocity, my thinking about guns has changed over the years. I'm no longer an NRA member. I stopped that after Gabby Giffords was brutally shot down in Arizona, a former colleague of mine. I don't ascribe to the NRA's positions on every issue. I'm not here to pick a fight with the NRA because I am a responsible gun owner. I think things like closing the gun show loophole, imposing vigorous and extensive, and then enforcing vigorous and extensive background checks when necessary. And I question now my support for the reciprocity as well. But you fall into traps in the business of politics because, like I said, we live in a time and in a culture, and it doesn't just apply to politics, where the mentality is you're either with me or you're against me. Well, we can be with each other and against each other. And what I hope that this campaign, and if I'm blessed enough to win, what my tenure as the next state auditor will be, is an opportunity to help try to mend these fences and bring us together. So in direct answer to the question, no, I don't. But it's a much more nuanced response that would be appropriate in connection with that question. And it applies not just to guns, but virtually every issue we see day in, day out. And my father's name is Socrates. I'm a proud Greek. I studied classical Greek in college, and I understand, the teachings of Aristotle when he espoused the virtue of moderation. We seem to have lost that in this country. And I hope that I can bring some common sense moderation back to government.
The rollout of Ohio's marijuana program has been plagued with some problems. The current auditor has gotten involved in that. What do you see yourself doing if you were auditor?
Well, first of all, with respect to Auditor Yost's involvement, and I don't fault him for that. I mean, it appears as though this process has been sloppy, and the process being following the rules of the legislature and the regulations that ensued concerning how this medical marijuana apparatus would be established. So auditing what appear to be obvious errors in process would seem appropriate to me. So I'm not here to fault Dave Yost at all, but to a large degree, what the auditor's office does is establish priorities. And I can tell you this, the legislature passed a law that the governor signed allowing for medical marijuana. Any of us who has a family member who have one of those listed conditions, maybe not all of us feel this way, but I certainly feel as though if this is going to give my loved one a chance at a better, improved quality of life, and I'm all for it. I think any efforts to stall the implementation of this law under the pretext of an audit would be a mistake and an injustice.
Tonight, Governor Casey gives his final State of the State speech. What do you want to hear in that?
Well, I'd like to hear him enthusiastically embrace the Zack space agenda when it comes to campaign finance reform and redistricting reform. I don't expect that. Here's what I'd like to hear from him. I know that the numbers are all coming in terms of where we are as a state, what the unemployment rate is, the new jobs, the new capital investments, all the things that go into a calculation as to how we measure progress, how we measure economic progress. And I know that the governor is going to tout those things that would suggest that things are going really well in Ohio. Here's what I'd like for him to do. I'd like for him to be honest with Ohioans. We have done some things well. He's done some things well. But there are things that he has not done well, and there are things this General Assembly have not done well. And the one thing they haven't done is they haven't worried about the bottom half. Millions of Ohioans live and work full-time in poverty. That is unacceptable. What is he doing about that? What is the General Assembly doing about lifting people out of poverty beyond words? People who are working full-time jobs and supporting families. What is he doing about wages in Ohio? Real wages. That I'd like to know. I'd like to hear him make a commitment to the bottom half as opposed to the top 1%.
Is the state Democratic Party in better shape today than it was in 2016?
I'd say it couldn't be any worse, right? Answer is yes. So, yes, the party itself, I think, is in good hands, and I think David Pepper has done a good job in terms of his organizational, administrative skills. He's rolling out good messages, and it would appear that we as a party have the wind at our backs. I'm not going to speculate as to why, but you all probably have a pretty good idea as to why. I think from a historical perspective, the first off year with the new president, the other party picks up seats. So I think history tells us, and the reality of what's happening in Washington tell us that this may be a really good year, but I think it is a huge mistake for Democrats to count on that. We need to work, and we need to engage, and we need to make sure that any victories that we attain this year are made sustainable and lasting. And the only way to do that is to connect in a real way with the people of this state who have been forgotten by this process. I'm not going to belabor this too much longer, but the people where I'm from, Tuscarawas County, and the counties that I represented in Congress, almost all of which were Appalachian counties, they feel left behind. They feel as though they have been forgotten by this political process. And I am committed as a candidate, not just to spending time in these counties that have been left behind, in engaging these voters, but encouraging other Democrats to do so as well. And I'm happy to say that David Pepper has acknowledged this. The party is spending more time in Appalachia, and I see that as a very, very positive sign.
And then lastly, returning to the specifics of the auditor's office, what are your top priorities for that office?
Okay, so I'm not going to repeat my speech, but my top priorities are, I'll tell you my very, very top priority. And then you can conclude what you will from that. When I told you in my speech that I was essentially called back to office, I mean, I felt the need to do this because of an utter belief, a total belief that our process is broken. And the broken process is one thing, but it's the consequences of a broken process are quite another. We need to do something to restore confidence and faith in the institution of politics, in the institution of government, in the very institution of democracy. And none of us can do this alone. All of us, however, can do this together. So I've got this great quote, and I'll end on this. Nathan on my staff offered me this. I hope I'm not attributing this to the right person. This is from Abraham Joshua Herschel, who was a famous rabbi and active in the civil rights movement. And he said, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And my point in making that and bringing that quote that Nathan brought to my attention up is that there are some who are guilty of making our politics divisive and structured in such a way that it's not, our politics are not serving the needs of our community. But every one of us has a responsibility to be a part of the problem. Every one of us has a responsibility to take our highest and best abilities to fix this. This is how I feel. So my top responsibility, my most important goal is I want to the extent that I can in this office, help bring faith and confidence back in the institution of government. That's why I'm running.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all for being with us. Again, Bruce, next up is Frank LaRose. We hope you'll join us for him. And following that, Kathleen Clyde. More information is on the website, the Akron Press Club website. Have a good afternoon, everybody.